Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. On this Tuesday, today is the 30th day of May in the year 2017. We have one more day of this month left, and then on Thursday, we'll enter the month of June. And I guess then we'll be, not calendar-wise, we won't be into summer, which doesn't begin until June 21st, I guess. But when you get to June and get beyond Memorial Day, it's pretty much summer, psychologically for most people. And we've had some of the warm weather to prove it, although we've had some cool weather recently. But let me welcome you to the Virtual Center and thank you for your continued support of the program, and more importantly, for your continued support of the Head On Radio Network and the efforts of Bob Kincaid and Agnes and those folks to keep this kind of programming on the air. Like you, over the last several days, I watched the president on his first overseas trip. And I guess like you, I was torn sometimes between crossing my fingers and hoping that nothing really bad happens. But then on this, at the same time, there is this expectation that tells me that something bad definitely will happen, because of the situation and the experiences we've had in the first 4 months of this administration. And of course, we know that that indeed many of those things did indeed happen. I was particularly struck by the ugly American side of the president's behavior. It's really interesting. I happen to be watching live when the situation happened where the president kind of elbowed his way in front of the prime minister of Montenegro and then began to straighten his jacket for a photo op. And I couldn't believe it when I saw it, but I was especially surprised that other people weren't commenting on it as well, at least not right away. And then finally, Frank Bruni in the New York Times wrote a column in which he addressed exactly that. And I was beginning to think to myself, maybe I was wrong. Maybe I missed and didn't see what I thought I saw. But he saw it, and he referred to it as the shove heard round the world. And I particularly enjoyed that article because it kind of confirmed what I thought I had been seeing, and indeed I did see it. And then a number of other people began to take notice of it as well. That and the handshake, the very famous handshake with the new president of France, Macron. And Macron himself made it clear afterwards that handshake was not just a happenstance, that there was a message associated with it. And he basically was trying to establish a firm position in his relationships with the president. And now that the president is back in Washington, of course, the stream of tweets has resumed. Tweets rather. They may be a lot of things, but tweet is not one of them. And so we are once again being deluged by a flood of tweets coming out of the White House. Castigating NATO and castigating Germany and Prime Minister Merkel and all the things that we have come to expect. So here we are. We're in beyond 120 days of the administration, and it's. I was going to say it's unclear as to what's going to happen. More and more people are beginning to speculate on what is indeed most likely to happen. What they are disagreeing about is how long it's going to take. But clearly something significant is going to happen, I believe. I know that many of you have opinions and thoughts and concerns about these same issues. We've been kind of derelict. We were on our program last week, but as you know, I was unable to do a program yesterday, and I apologize for that. But we have a phone number, and we do invite you to share your thoughts on some of these issues with our other listeners, not just with me, obviously. I'd love to hear you, but I know that our other listeners would like to hear you as well. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. That's 304-663-4676. If you'd like to communicate with me one-on-one via email, I would love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN 906. That's all one word, lowercase, at gmail.com. And over the weekend, I began to post a few things once again on our Facebook page. So, in fact, I'd like to open our program today with one or two of those comments that I put on Facebook. For those of you who have not visited our Facebook page, I invite you to do that. If you go to Facebook, to the homepage, there's a search box at the top. And if you type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will have access to our Facebook page. And finally, beginning last week, and I know Bob has told me that there are stream issues associated with the server, from what I understand. And there have been situations where the server has gone down. I know one night it went down on Bob during his program as well, as I heard. So there is a backup that you can go to, a backup stream, and it's called Head On Live. So if something happens in the course of our program today and you lose the signal, then I invite you to just reconnect by going to headon.live and getting access to the stream that way. Apparently, from what Bob put on Facebook one day last week, the streamer at White Rose Society is having some issues. And, well, let me change that. The folks at White Rose Society are having some issues with the streamer or the server. That's a better way to put it. To say that the server has issues makes it sound a little bit like it has life. It may, for all we know, it may. But anyway, I do welcome you to today's program, and I want to thank you in advance for your support and for your continued support of the Head On Radio Network. I mentioned that I'd like to touch on a few things that I put on Facebook over the weekend and just make comments to them. The first thing was the article that I referred to just a moment ago by Frank Bruni in the New York Times, and the so-called shove heard round the world. Bruni's message, of course, is that it's becoming clear that you can learn as much, if not more, about the president and where the president is coming from by his body language than you can by what comes out of his mouth. Because Bruni makes the point that the words that come out of President Trump's mouth have proven to be a lot less trustworthy than the body language that speaks volumes about his priorities. Bruni says, and this is a quote, his words can be counterfeit. His gestures are genuine. And then Bruni takes the president to task about the curtsy that he made to King Salman in Saudi Arabia. Not the curtsy itself, but the hypocrisy associated with it. Because you may recall, I know I do, when President Obama behaved in like manner with the president in Saudi Arabia, and curtsied as a matter of respect. Donald Trump attacked him. So Bruni makes the point that it's quite hypocritical on the president's part to do something exactly the same thing that he criticized President Obama for. And I love the way Bruni writes. He says, "Hypocrisy, thy name is Trump, and thy knees are bent, and thy head is bowed." So again, the issue of the body language and what it tells us about him. And of course, I mentioned that you kind of cross your fingers and hope that nothing embarrassing happens. Well, of course, the shove, I think, was embarrassing. There were a number of other things as well. As when, for example, President Trump arrives in Israel and the first words out of his mouth in front of a microphone are, "We just got back from the Middle East." The implication being, of course, that Israel is in South Africa somewhere. Bruni makes the point that our diplomat, Ron Dermer, briefly buried his head in his hands at that comment about Israel not being implying that Israel is not in the Middle East. So the beat continues. The beat goes on, as they say. I posted that on Facebook because I thought the shove was very, very significant. It took a while for others to come around and kind of agree with me, but I think they did. And then yesterday, it's really interesting. I put a tweet on in the middle of the day yesterday, Monday, Memorial Day. And the reason I did is because this was on Sunday, I was watching the Sunday news programs. And I ended up watching one that I usually don't watch regularly, and there's no reason for that. But this was ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos. And for those of you who regularly watch it, you may remember or recall that George Stephanopoulos was not hosting the program this weekend. Martha Raddatz was, and many of you will remember Martha Raddatz as the moderator for one of the debates that we saw prior to the 2016 elections. And there was quite a bit on the program. It was an hour long, and there was quite a bit on it. And, Adam Schiff was on it, the head of the Democratic minority on the House Intelligence Committee investigating the Russian situation with President Trump. And there are a number of other people on. But one of the segments that really got my attention was a segment with three people who knew Donald Trump really well, his biographers. Timothy O'Brien was one who wrote a significant biography of Donald Trump some time ago. And the other panelist was a regular ABC reporter for the White House, who's been following President Trump pretty carefully and kind of knows quite a bit about him as a result. The third panelist in this group was a woman named Gwenda Blair, and I have to admit I had never seen or heard from her before. Turns out that she's been a confidant of Donald Trump for better than 40 years. She's known him and known him well during that entire period. As I watched this discussion, a lot of it was predictable. Martha Raddatz, I thought, did a great job moderating the discussion among these three folks. And much of the discussion about the president's personality are things that I think most of us could have predicted and know. His reaction when he gets in front of a microphone, cameras, crowds, loud music, the rock star image. All things we probably knew about. But then Gwenda Blair made a comment about Donald Trump based on the 40 years plus that she's known him, which really got me thinking. She said, quote, "Donald Trump is the most competitive person who ever lived," unquote. When I put this on Facebook Sunday, one of the first people to respond to it was our friend from Taiwan, Horst. And he introduced Theodore Roosevelt as perhaps the most competitive person who ever lived. But the issue, and I think his comment, Horst's comments speak to this as well, that he was quite aware. The issue wasn't a debate over who the most competitive person in the world might be. The issue is the statement itself. What I did when I watched this and heard this was just sit there for a couple of minutes and reflected on the significance of what Gwenda Blair was saying. Somebody him well defines him as the most competitive person who ever lived. And I was thinking, reflecting on this for a moment, and I thought to myself, imagine what that means, what that says. Obviously, within his very, very unique definition of success, the president is very successful. So in other words, all the measures, all the markers that go with competition are in his favor and suggest that he is indeed a very successful person, as indicated by the markers that matter most to him: income, profit, investments, influence, prestige, visibility, all of it. But the fact of the matter is, this comment resonated with me more than almost anything I'd heard or read about Donald Trump. This is what I said on Facebook. Imagine for a moment what that says, what it means. Transpose that same personality, the most competitive person who ever lived, into the White House. When you do that, many things that may not have made all that much sense begin to make some sense. Think for a moment about his budget, his proposed budget. The gargantuan cuts in social programs in the budget outline that he has already released. Many people have referred to them as inhuman. The level of tax cuts proposed for the wealthiest Americans and the people who get the benefit of those tax cuts. Clearly, not people who need them, but one could almost say people who've earned them. Consider for a moment the obvious contradictions between what candidate Trump said last year during the campaign and what he's advocating as president in terms of policy priorities. We know that in Donald Trump, we're dealing with the salesmen who say always whatever the people want to hear. The policymaker, now as president, the policymaker who truly believes that what he is and what he stands for is what all of us should want to be, what all of us should want to believe. I'm thinking that he thinks that what he's proposing is best for us. I'm kind of putting thoughts in his head, words in his mouth, so to speak. But I'm thinking to myself, what he stands for is what he believes we'd want to be if only we knew what was best for us. Fact is, he thinks he does. It's a classic example of promoting policies which on the surface contradict everything you ran for office on. His base, the forgotten Americans that he promised to represent and to give a fair shake to, the jobs he promised to bring back, the swamp he promised to drain, and on and on and on. What's in that budget seems to contradict so blatantly what the president claimed he stood for when he ran for office that one might jump to the conclusion that he's nothing but a hypocrite, that he'll say anything that people want to hear in order to maintain his popularity and get that applause that he seems to need so very, very badly. But then you look at what he's proposing in his budget and look at what he was endorsing in the American Health Care Act, the health care bill that the House passed a few weeks ago that is now in limbo in the Senate. According to the Congressional Budget Office, 23 million people losing their health care over the next 10 years. $834 billion over 10 years taken from Medicaid. Plus another $164 billion reallocated within the budget, within the Medicaid budget. What that amounts to, according to the Congressional Budget Office estimate on that health care bill, is effectively removing 45% of the Medicaid budget. I mean, if you think about that, 45% of the budget, of the money allocated for Medicare, would be gone by 2026 if this thing passed. How do you deal with the obvious contradiction? Gwenda Blair's comment about his competitiveness, at least in my mind, seemed to kind of suggest that that's the only way that you can see a little bit less contradiction that appears on the surface. Is there any way that what he ran for on the campaign trail and the policies he's advocating as president, rather than being blatant contradictions, is there any way that they could be seen as consistent somehow? The more I think about that comment about Trump's competitiveness, the more I can begin to see a note of such consistency. If I dare put words in his mouth, it seems to me that what he seems to be saying is, I know, because of who I am and what I've accomplished, I know what makes this nation great. I know what this nation has lost over the years that has reduced its greatness. I know what we have to do in order to make America great again. I know better than you do what you ought to stand for, what you ought to want. But I also know that you'll never ask for it. Never go after the things you should go after. I'm in a position to know what those things are. I know what's best for you better than in the healthcare bill. People, millions of people, which is the mythology that our system of freedom. I've shared this story before, but I think it's really a powerful. I've said that I don't consider myself, when it comes to the Depression or when it comes to President Herbert Hoover, from the things I've read about him, the speeches that he's delivered that I've read, I've come to appreciate Herbert Hoover the man. I've come to recognize in the history that I've read that Herbert Hoover is a good man. He wasn't born into money, he was born poor. He struggled and was able to acquire a degree in engineering. He became an engineer, a damn good engineer. He believed in the America of mythology, the myth of self-help, the myth of Horatio Alger, picking yourself up by your own bootstraps and not looking to other people for handouts, not watching what other people have, but just concentrating on what you can legitimately claim rights to. Herbert Hoover believed that the American system of free enterprise capitalism worked. When he found himself as President of the United States in the throes of a depression, where 25% of the working people in this country had lost their jobs, Hoover believed that it was an aberration because he believed this system worked. And he was proof positive that it worked. Donald Trump, I believe, sees himself as proof positive that this system works if you behave and if you play it the way the rules of the game have been written to work. Hoover did more to try to get the nation out of the Depression than any president had ever done before in history. But there were limits. There were limits to what he would and would not do. Hoover believed more than anything else that people helping themselves, working hard, playing fair by the rules, would bring this economy back because he believed in the system so strongly. He believed that the system worked. Consequently, he had to believe that the Depression was an aberration, that eventually the economy would straighten itself out if we just hung in there with it long enough. But for people who were desperate, they couldn't hang in there any longer. When Congress passed a bill to assist agriculture, because if you read the story of the 1920s, it was the farmer that experienced depression before anybody else. The price of overseas sales in agricultural products had plunged. farmers were producing more than the market could sustain, and the prices for their good that they were getting for their goods continued to go down and down and down. In order to assist farmers, Congress passed legislation that would make it possible for them to keep up mortgage payments, to not lose their farms, and all the rest of it. Hoover vetoed the bill. The next year, Congress passed very similar legislation to help farmers, but this time it was primarily focused on providing food for farm animals. That one Hoover signed. And his explanation was predictable. If government provides direct aids to farmers, farmers will lose all incentive to do for themselves. They'll lose their work ethic. They'll look to government to take care of their needs. And when that happens, when too many people become dependent on government, Hoover believed, the miracle of the American free enterprise system can't work. But Hoover believed that if you provided food for the animals, if the animals make it, then the farmers will make it. It seems to demonstration what he did do to meet the challenges of the Depression. Hoover believed in the system. He believed in its institutions. The most significant piece of legislation passed during Hoover's term as president was banking legislation. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which provided government money, loans, to banks, insurance companies, railroads, all the rest of it. Hoover would support propping up our institutions, but he could not support providing direct aid to people, because his sense was that if government did that, it would destroy people's willingness and incentive to work and to help themselves. The old story of teaching somebody to fish rather than giving somebody a fish. I believe that there's quite a bit of that in Donald Trump. I know that some people are going to say this almost sounds like an excuse or a justification for the behavior of the president. I'm not looking at it that way. I'm just trying to understand what makes this man tick. And I believe that comment from somebody who knows him so well, the most competitive person who ever lived. And again, I mean, obviously that's debatable. Other people might come up with other people that they would claim to be the most competitive person. That's not the point. The point is, if you take the statement for what it says, just assume for a moment it's true. Assume that everybody who knows agrees that this is the most competitive person who ever lived. What would that mean in terms of what he says and what he does? And I've begun to see some similarities in the two. I know, because I'm guilty of it also. of pointing out the inconsistencies between what candidate Trump pledged or promised and what President Trump delivered. But the fact of the matter is, there is some consistency in it if you look at it in certain ways. I'm not defending the consistency. I'm just suggesting it might indeed be there. I personally am very, very uncomfortable when I run into people who claim to know what's best for me better than I do. I get up in arms. I resent that. But the fact of the matter is, in a system based on competition, if you consider yourself the most competitive person who ever lived, then by definition, you know what the system demands because you've done it. You've experienced it. And you have the bank account to prove it. So it's a little bit hard to argue with you that there's more to the system than that. Because for the way you define your goals and your perspectives, you've played the rules or played the game exactly the way the game was drawn up to be played. And you came out on top. So therefore, that would naturally give you a sense that you have the right to define good for other people, to tell other people how they should live their lives. The fact of the matter is, if you think back through American history, this becomes one of the themes that seems to define American history through much of the nation's existence. An innate sense that we know best how other people should live their lives, how they should run their economies, how they should elect their leaders, how they should educate their children, how they should structure their political system. We've believed that. If you doubt it for a minute, think about the concept of nation building. Jeremy Surrey, historian at the University of Texas in Austin, Jeremy Surrey says about nation building, it's liberty's surest guardian. That's the title of his book. He says in his introduction that nation building is in America's DNA. That ultimately our whole approach to the world is to do everything we can do to refashion and restructure the world in our own image. The more successful we are in creating little versions of ourselves, the more successful we will be in dealing with them. How many times have you heard political leaders, not just of one party either? I heard Republicans say this. George W. Bush, for example. Democracies don't fight wars against each other. If we can bring about the expansion of democracies throughout the world, we can eliminate war. Because democracies, by definition, have figured out that there's more to be gained by working out differences than fighting over them. There's a note of arrogance in that. There's a little bit of political narcissism in that, and economic narcissism as well. So I personally think that comment by Gwenda Blair about President Trump, Donald Trump, being the most competitive person who ever lived is extremely significant for what it implies about how he behaves and what he thinks and how he thinks. If you take it to its logical extremes, and there's obviously dangers inherent in doing this, and maybe this takes it too far, but you can conclude from that the idea that you don't need to learn. There's nothing more to learn. You know what works. You know how the system is set up. You know how it's supposed to work. You've proved it does work. For you, anyway. So therefore, you naturally conclude that if other people behaved the same way you did and acted the same way you do, then they too would experience the same success. There's arrogance in that. One would feel comfortable in getting most of their news from television rather than from reading. Whereas the president has said, I don't have time to read. Besides, what more is there to know? I know everything that I need to know. It's dangerous. But I would suggest to you, in certain ways, it's realistic. It's a possibility. It seems to explain more things than it leaves unexplainable. Anyway, again, that particular interview program on Sunday morning this week with Martha Raddatz was an hour long, and there were several guests on, and there were several discussions that took place on the program. And I kind of thought to myself as I was posting this on Facebook later Sunday afternoon, I've got to be the only person that's focusing on that particular segment of the program because there was so much relevant on there. I think they had John Kelly, Homeland Security Director, on there. I know they had Adam Schiff on there. Adam Schiff talking about the Russian investigation in the House committee on which he sits, co-chairs. And those are the interviews and the segments that would get most of the media attention. But I thought this roundtable discussion about the personality of the president was extremely significant. And that's why I wanted to take this opportunity to share it with you on today's program. One additional item that struck me during my reading over the previous time when we haven't been together as regularly as we should here at the Virtual Center. In last Sunday's, not this past Sunday's, not day before yesterday, but a week ago, in last Sunday's New York Times Sunday magazine, there was a featured article on Jared Kushner. Obviously, it got priority attention in the Sunday New York Times because Jared Kushner was beginning to get more and more attention as the Russian investigations went on. And suddenly, more and more people were concerned about and wondering about who he was, how he got where he is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there was a featured article in the Sunday magazine entitled Jared Kushner's Other Real Estate Empire. The author of this article was Alex McGillis. The publication date was May 23rd. So it was 7 days ago. I have to say that before I finished this article, my wife did. And she sent me a forward from her phone and said, "You got to read this article about Jared Kushner." I was already into it, but I hadn't finished it. We've talked about this article a lot over the last 4 or 5 days. And especially as more and more attention is being heaped on the personality and the behavior of Jared Kushner. This back channel communications with the Kremlin, for example, which is getting most of the attention over the last 2 or 3 days. And the extent to which key spokesmen for the administration are coming out and defending it or justifying it, saying back channel communications like this are what goes on all the time. So said Kellyanne Conway this morning on Fox and Friends. John Kelly, Homeland Security Director John Kelly, supported or endorsed this kind of back channel communications with other nations, especially nations with whom you have problems, like we do and have had consistently with with Russia, going back to the Soviet Union, going back to the Cold War. But think of the unanimity that exists in all aspects of the media in terms of attitudes towards Russia. It doesn't matter whether you have Fox or MSNBC, whether you're talking to a Democratic leader or a Republican leader. There's almost unanimity. Russia is not our friend. Russia is never our friend. Whenever Russia seems to be doing something for our benefit and agenda, there's something you're not considering, because you can't trust Russia. You can't trust the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And the Russia we're dealing with today with Putin is the closest throwback we've got to the Soviet Union that collapsed when the wall came down in the late 1980s. There is a universal, acceptable public opinion about Russia that goes all the way back to the end of World War I 100 years ago. We are in 2017. The United States entered World War I in 1917, 100 years ago. Since that time, and since the Tsar was overthrown by the Bolsheviks, and America was forced to deal with the realities of a major nation in the world having gone communist. Ever since that time, there's been an innate sense that our greatest enemy is Russia and what Russia stands for. Even though the Soviet Union has fallen, more than a few commentators have made the point of establishing the connection between Vladimir Putin and the KGB from which he came during the height of the Cold War. Conclusion: nothing's changed. And the fact of the matter is, Russian behavior confirms these suspicions. the Russian involvement in our elections. It's pretty much accepted now by everybody that there was Russian interference in the elections. How much, what effect it had, whether it did affect the outcome, whether the Trump administration was in collusion, undertaken being studied by the investigators. But that Russia did indeed interfere in our election process is pretty much accepted up and down the line. I just heard John McCain make the point that as great of a threat as ISIS is, Russia remains a greater one, because Russia is committed to weakening the very foundations of our republic. They tried to do it in tampering with our elections. They continue to do it in interfering with the elections in other democracies. Increasingly, the sentiment exists that even though the Cold War officially is over, it really isn't. And we can't afford to let down our guard for 1 minute. And in part, that's what makes the alleged behavior of Jared Kushner so suspicious and so shocking to so many people. The one thing it has done is it's drawn attention to Jared Kushner, who he is, what makes him tick, all the rest of it. I was struck, as was by this article last week in the Times, dated the 23rd of May. It's an expose on Kushner Industries real estate buyer. It's a classic statement in real estate. But it also is a classic statement of behavior and attitudes towards those who live in the holdings of Kushner Industries. This particular article opens with a story about a tenant in Maryland, in one of the townhouses owned by Kushner Industries in Maryland, in and around Baltimore, in the Baltimore County area. Turns out that the company representing the real estate owners is a company named JK2 Westminster LLC, Limited Liability Corporation. JK2, the number 2, Westminster. Turns out that this company, Westminster LLC, has hauled hundreds of tenants into court in recent years for reneging on their rent or on their leases, for breaking their leases, various other things. The article points out that many of the tenants are quite confused because when they signed their lease, they signed it with a company called Sawyer Realty Holdings. They have no idea how Sawyer Realty Holdings became JK2 Westminster LLC. Even more than that, they are totally oblivious to how these businesses are merely subsidiaries of a much larger real estate company based in New York, Kushner Companies. Turns out that the JK in Westminster is Jared Kushner, president of the firm, son-in-law of the President of the United States. Over the last 5 years, Kushner Industries Jared and his father Charles, who served jail time for fraud, and as many of us realize or know, was prosecuted by Governor Chris Christie in New Jersey. Kushner Industries, over the last 5 years, has acquired the rights to over 8,000 apartment units and townhouses in Maryland alone. It turns out that that's merely the tip of the iceberg. Here's a quote from a paragraph, which gives you some idea of in high-powered, high-end, run at the time by Jared and his father Charles, bought the aluminum-clad skyscraper at 666 Fifth Avenue for a record-breaking $1.8 billion. Fifth Avenue for $1.8 billion. Turns out that really wasn't a good investment. It appears that they overpaid. The evidence is, at the same time, the Metropolitan Life Insurance building on Fifth Avenue sold for a lot less. In fact, the price for the Metropolitan Life building was in the area of $600 per square foot. What the Kushners paid was $1,200 a square foot for the building they bought on Fifth Avenue. Kushners are determined to make good on this investment. They are still seeking partners. Their plan to invest $12 billion and replace the existing building with a glass tower that would be 40 stories taller. In 2013, they acquired 17 buildings in Manhattan's East Village for about $130 million. 3 years later, they spent $715 million on a cluster of buildings owned by the Jehovah's Witnesses in Brooklyn. In the mid-2000s, Kushner Industries began to sell off more than 25,000 multifamily units it owned. In 2007, 17,000 family units sold in one transaction for $1.9 billion. As the company moved under Jared's control, after he graduated from college and was forced to take over the company because he was in jail, his focus began to shift from its New Jersey roots to New York City. And then in 2007, the Great Recession hit. And thousands upon thousands of distress-ridden Class B properties in poorer sections of major American cities came on the market as more and more people found themselves in rental units they could no longer afford and were forced to vacate. Jared moved in. This is a quote from Jared Kushner. Our goal is to keep buying and incrementally growing. They're good markets where you can get good yield. Unquote. As of today, Westminster Management lists 34 different complexes in Maryland, Ohio, and New Jersey, with a total of 20,000 rental units. over the last 5 years, court records in Maryland show that Westminster was the plaintiff in more than 550 cases where renters defaulted on their rent. The article claims that the number is much higher than 550 because many of the filings are in the name of Kushner's subsidiary companies rather than Westminster. And the bulk of this article recounts case after case of hauling the most desperate people into court, sometimes for an amount of back rent that seems almost too small to even bother with. But they have operated on the assumption that no amount is too small. Because the fact of the matter is they're dealing with such volume of rentals that they can't afford for the word to even get out there, the idea that they might be lax on following up on late rents. So they've made it a point to go after anybody for anything. Also, the article points out that many times when they bought the entire complex, they purchased the debts owned by the sellers. And at that point, they decided to push recovery of these debts as far as they could. In Baltimore County, outside Baltimore, the Carroll Park complex is owned by Westminster. The author of this study, Alex McGillis, talked to a private investigator in Baltimore County named Mike McHarg, who said, quote, "They're nothing but slumlords. They take everyone's money." McGillis says that when he asked if they knew who was behind the company, Jared Kushner, they said no, they didn't. They said, "I'm a Trump supporter. I had no idea that these companies were owned by the president's son-in-law." One of the things that comes through in this article very, very clearly is that these real estate investments are exactly that. They are business deals. They are investments. There is no room for anything like compassion or empathy for anybody in this business, at least in this business at this level. There is no compassion to this level of success. Why do I mention this as being relevant here on this program when we're talking about the current political situation underway in this country? Not only because Jared Kushner sits so close to the president, not only because daughter Ivanka and Jared are placed on the stage right behind the podium when Donald Trump overseas delivers most important comments to most important people. They are sitting right there. What really motivates me in all of this, the base responsible for President Trump's election last November. If there's one thing that became very clear through the campaign, it was Donald Trump's avowed compassion for those people who had fallen through the cracks, those people that were being left behind in programs of the federal government, those people that were losing their jobs permanently, those people that had given up all hope. White, middle class, working people, largely uneducated. I'm remembering President Trump's comment in one of his campaign speeches. We really love our uneducated people. The one thing that comes through in this entire administration is its claim to compassion. It's why people voted for this particular president. It's the change that people voted for. And yet, when you see this particular study of the Kushner real estate empire, it becomes very obvious that there's no room for compassion at this level in this business. This is business. We're talking billion-dollar investments, billion-dollar sales. We're talking power and influence. None of these things, it seems to me, come equipped with the baggage of compassion. I see a major contradiction between the administration's image and what it proposes to do. More specifically, I'm struck by the inconsistencies and the contradictions between President Trump's health care plan and his proposed budget on the one hand, and this particular story about Jared Kushner's real estate empire on the other. This weekend, when he returned from his overseas trip, President Trump made it a point to warmly endorse and support the loyalty and skills and abilities of his son-in-law. In the face of all the criticisms of Jared Kushner that surfaced during the week that President Trump was out of the country, President Trump no sooner got back than he sprang to his son-in-law's defense, not even questioning the behavior. I think what we have here is insight. Insight as to what we on the national level. Let me make a connection I hadn't even thought about as I was putting together or thinking about today's program. The comments made toward the beginning of our program about Gwenda Blair's characterization of Donald Trump as the most competitive person who ever lived, and his admiration for his son-in-law, who obviously, I think all of us would assume, meets the president's definition of a successful businessman, of a successful son-in-law. What I'm suggesting then is that this idea we developed earlier today about the president's competitiveness and his success, more important, his understanding of and complete faith in the system of free enterprise, which made it impossible for him to be so successful. That very formula is being worked out or played out in his own family by his son-in-law. So the question is, what is the difference between what they say and what they do? Between the compassion they preach and the cold-hearted business realities of their day-to-day lives. I think a lot of people are going to be disappointed. I think when 23 million people lose their health care, they're liable to be more than just disappointed. How is it that the president, who claims such compassion, can support a health care bill which does that to 23 million people? How do you square this? It seems to me, I think we nailed it at the beginning. There's only one way to do it. And that is to conclude that the president believes that what he's advocating is going to bring the system back to where it ought to be. This, I would argue, might be Donald Trump's road to making America great again. Part of it is starving the beast, literally reducing the federal budget to the point that government can no longer sustain the social programs, the social safety net on which so many Americans have become so dependent. To create an economic and social environment in America where people are forced to do for themselves once again, which is what these folks believe works. It worked for them. The fact that they didn't start at the same depths as the people who are tenants in Kushner's properties is a bit of a problem, true. But the fact of the matter is, there's a little bit of consistency possible when you see their goals as being one of reestablishing an America that existed prior to the progressive movement, prior to the progressive assumptions which drive big government and have driven big government throughout so much of the 20th century and have taken us into the 21st. If you accept this as possibly realistic, then it seems to me we are confronted with some very discomforting realities. The president said definitively during the campaign, "No way in the world am I ever going to allow anything to happen to your health care or to your Social Security." I find it difficult to believe. So many people are totally dependent on Social Security, the retired, the elderly. But we know also that in many professions, in many fields, people are retiring long before they stop working. People are engaged in second and third professional careers. They're working full-time at good salaries at the same time that they are collecting retirement benefits from their previous career. Obviously, from the perspective of total faith in the free enterprise system as working the way it was designed to work, there's an awful lot of fluff in a program as big as Social Security. Likewise, there's fluff in a program which is bringing health care to so many people, whether in fact they've earned it or not, whether in fact they need it or not. Senator Cotton, not Castle. Senator Cotton from Arkansas made the point during the healthcare debate some weeks ago. Healthcare is important. But the fact of the matter is it's much more important than the people who are working and contributing to the welfare of the nation. It's much more important that they be happy and healthy than it is that retired people who are no longer contributing materially to the nation. We have to expect, as these people age, that their health will deteriorate. We can't afford to do everything that medicine can do for people that don't need that much of an investment. I would suggest to you the mentality here is somewhat the same. Healthcare for people who have earned it, or who can help pay for it, or who can make material contributions to society at large, is the key ingredient in all of this. It's my belief that all of this speaks to some serious issues. And I just wanted to share them with you in hopes that you can reflect on them and maybe expand a little bit upon them yourselves. Obviously, none of this is definitive. It's all speculation. It's all asking you to reflect and think at the possibilities. But the irony is that when you do, many things which up until now we've not been able to explain become kind of explainable. So maybe there's something to it. I leave the rest to you. It's now 10 minutes before the hour. We've got a little bit less than 10 minutes left in our program today. I really didn't expect to take the entire hour and 20 minutes of an hour and 30-minute program on these particular issues. I didn't think that they would necessarily go that long. One of the areas I wanted to get into, and we'll do it tomorrow, unless something comes up, obviously, that makes it impossible and forces us to go in a different direction. I wanted to return to consideration of the technology question and the extent to which technology, in the minds of many people, is taking over the priorities of society. We dealt with this last Wednesday. One of the statements I remember making was that from the very beginning, technology has always been viewed as a service to mankind. But many people are beginning to get the idea that technology has ceased to be servant of the people and indeed has become the driver of our contemporary society. Last Wednesday, if you'll recall, we spent quite a bit of time with Thomas Kuhn and his structure of scientific revolutions, and Kuhn's critique of what he called normal science. It seems to me, and I thought about this after the program last Wednesday, and I think I made the point, but I don't know if I emphasized it enough. I think it's very significant because many people look to science, to research, as ways to solve many of our problems, many of them created by technology, interestingly enough. In other words, many believe that technology, inherent in technology, are so many miracles that even though technology at times creates problems, it also contains the ingredients of solutions to those problems. In other words, the cure for technology is more technology in the minds of many people. And then there are others who are holding up their hands and saying, stop, think, reflect for a moment. Some years ago, I've mentioned this before, and I'm doing this principally because we have so little time left in our program today. I just want to kind of lay the groundwork for an introduction to our program tomorrow. Some years ago, in the early 90s, I've mentioned on the program before that I came across 10 questions which the director of the honors program at Princeton University had sketched out for honors students in introductory history courses at Princeton University. And the architect of those 10 questions made the point that these 10 questions, he believes, ought to form the basis or the guts, if you will, of a good college history class. That what makes a history class a good college history class is its ability to get students to reflect on some of these major questions. And I'm not going back through all of them because I want to deal with one, which is technology. But some of the questions you may recall are questions like the meaning of life. How do we know what we know? How do we know that what we know to be true is true? How do we judge? How do we evaluate? How do we pursue truth? How do we know truth? These kinds of deep, abstract questions. This particular official at Princeton believed really ought to be the heart and soul of a meaningful college history class. The third question on his list of 10 related specifically to technology. The question was as follows: how does technology affect our humanity? The answer is that it does. It affects our humanity. There are some sub-questions or follow-up questions which clarify the full implications of the question itself. Example: does the use of some technology help make us more human, and the other kinds of technology make us less human? Is it that the mere use of technology, the employment of technology, affects our humanity in positive ways and or negative ways? Here's a second follow-up question. Can the use of technology dehumanize us? Third one, just about every invention is a double-edged sword with the potential to enhance our humanity as well as detract from our humanity. Is this true? Is the answer in the technology, or is it within us? Is there ever a time when technology is rejected because it outweighs its projected positives? What do you do when the employment of a particular kind of technology threatens outcomes which are worse than the positives that cause you to consider? Is it possible to reject the technology? And finally, are there some people better able to make those calls than others? If so, who and how? What makes them more qualified? This gets into the issues that we were dealing with in today's program about I know better what's best for you than you do. Are there certain people that are really qualified to make decisions like that? If there are, who are they? People, the most successful people, the best educated people, the brightest people, the most creative people, the hardest working people, the best connected. All of those issues, it seems to me, are significant. What tomorrow's program, and we're down to the top of the hour, or we're up to the top of the hour, I should say. I'd like that to become the groundwork for tomorrow as we pursue these issues of technology and raise some of these serious questions about technology. I think that you'll find tomorrow's program interesting. I sure hope so. For Bob Kincaid, Agnes, and the folks on, and for me and the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Research, thank you so much for being with us today. I hope the program has been in your day. I hope it serves to make a good day an even better one. Thank you.